In the skies over the Black Sea, a British Royal Air Force Voyager is cruising calmly. The multi-role tanker transport aircraft had left Great Britain about 4 hours before. In the plane, everything is calm and quiet. But then, suddenly and out of nowhere, the Airbus pitches down violently. Only seconds later, the aircraft is in a dangerous dive towards the dark ocean below. What happened here, and how did this unbelievable accident end? Let's find out. Welcome to Airspace. On the 9th of February 2014, shortly after lunchtime, a Royal Air Force Voyager left Brize Norton Air Force Base in the southern United Kingdom. It was headed to Camp Bastion Airfield in Afghanistan. On board the aircraft were 2 pilots, 7 flight attendants and 189 passengers, most of them British servicemen. A good 3 hours later, the Voyager cruised calmly over the Black Sea while it was under Turkish air traffic control. Now, you might be wondering, what is a Voyager? I'm glad you asked, because to me it looked eerily similar to an Airbus A330. That's because, in fact, it is one. The A330 Voyager MRTT, which is short for multi-role tanker transport, is a military derivative of the Airbus A330. It can, as the name states, serve a variety of roles, such as providing refueling services to fighter jets, or alternatively, transport cargo or passengers. On the day of the accident, the A330 was equipped with normal passenger seats in order to transport military personnel to Afghanistan. On board the aircraft, everything was quiet. So quiet, in fact, that the first officer had left the flight deck for a short break, leaving the captain alone in the cockpit. The autopilot was engaged, and therefore, as a side note, both side sticks were locked in place. As the sole occupant of the flight deck, the captain quickly became rather bored. The radio frequency was pretty much silent, and outside, night had settled. But luckily, the captain had brought his trusty camera with him. To pass the time, he took some night shots of the cockpit. As he did so, the first officer met a former colleague of his in the forward galley, located just behind the cockpit. The two had a friendly chat that lasted longer than a normal cockpit absence would normally last. But since the flight was so quiet, nobody minded his absence too much. Some minutes later, the chief flight attendant passed the first officer on the way to check on the lone captain in the cockpit. A welcome distraction for the board pilot in command. For the brief chat, the captain interrupted his photographic endeavors and put the camera down. But then, very suddenly, the Voyager entered an abrupt and unexpected nosedive. In the span of just 3 seconds, the pitch of the aircraft decreased from plus 2.5 to minus 17 degrees. This equates to pretty much full forward nose-down input if somebody were to command this for whatever reason. Immediately, the captain and everyone else on board started to feel weightless. Some passengers and crew members were thrown to the ceiling like tennis balls in a washing machine. In a panic, the captain tried to pull up from the unexpected dive, but his side stick did not move at all. To him, it seemed as if it was still locked in place by the autopilot. Frantically, he tried to disengage the autopilot, but to no avail. He kept pulling on the stick and pushing the disconnect button, but nothing happened. Meanwhile, in the forward galley, the first officer was violently thrown to the ceiling of the A330. He heard the captain calling for him from the cockpit, mixed with alarms coming from the plunging Airbus. Luckily, he was able to get his bearings and hold on to a nearby handhold, but he actually found himself standing on the ceiling of the cabin. The descent had become so pronounced that the resulting forces seemed to flip gravity upside down. Quickly, he made his way to the cockpit via the ceiling and found utter chaos. The captain was screaming in despair that he couldn't disengage the autopilot and that the first officer should take a seat and try himself. Thinking quickly, the co-pilot reached down and tried to pull back on his own side stick while still standing on the ceiling. It had little effect, so he clambered down into his seat, pushed the autopilot disconnect button, but nothing happened. But then, quickly, he found that his side stick wasn't locked, and a quick glance at the instrument panel confirmed that indeed, the autopilot was in fact off. He pulled back on the side stick and finally, the aircraft returned to level flight. Are you enjoying this video so far? If you do, I'm happy to announce that now you can actually leave a super thanks here on my channel. Hit that button right here if you'd like to support my work, and you'll get a highlighted comment that I can quickly respond to. Or, if you want to make a more lasting contribution, check out my Patreon link in the description. I have many cool benefits for as little as $3 per month. It's a small amount, but it really helps me continue to make these videos for you. Now, let's get back to the story. When the crewmen were finally able to grasp what had happened, they found that the aircraft had dropped 4,400 feet, or 1,341 meters, in just 27 seconds. The aircraft had developed an overspeed condition and had reached a maximum descent rate of 15,800 feet per minute. To give you an idea how much that is, usually emergency descents in case of cabin depressurization are flown at rates of descent of around 6,000 feet per minute, so this crew reached a descent rate about 2.5 times higher than that. Back in the cabin, 33 people were injured. Since the captain did not know what had caused the problem, he and his first officer decided to land as soon as possible to get the patients treated properly. They dumped 20 tons of fuel and landed at Incirlik Air Base in southern Turkey a while later. An investigation into the matter was quickly initiated. Soon, investigators found out that in fact, all systems of the A330 had worked as they had been designed. No fault was to be found, especially not in the autopilot systems. But then, what had caused this accident? To find out, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorders were analyzed and items from the flight deck were collected. Quickly, investigators found something odd. After the first officer had left the flight deck, it seemed pretty obvious that the captain was rather bored. Yawning could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder, and soon after, the captain started taking 28 pictures over the next 8 minutes, including this very fancy zoomy picture of the flight instruments. This is per se not prohibited, as long as it doesn't interfere with the rest of the duties. When analysts took a look at the flight data recorder, they saw that soon after the purser had entered the flight deck to talk to the captain, a small but distinct and constant forward input on the captain's side stick was present. This input was small enough to keep the autopilot engaged. The autopilot will not act on such a small input. It will only disengage if the force is large enough. 1 minute and 44 seconds after his first input was registered, the captain moved his seat forward using the electrical adjustment switch on his seat. Just at that moment, a sudden input in the maximum forward direction was registered on the captain's side stick. The autopilot disengaged immediately, which went unnoticed by the captain, and the Voyager entered a violent nosedive. It quickly reached the maximum nose down pitch the Airbus will allow a pilot to attain, which is minus 15 degrees. By the constant forward pressure on the stick, this limit was slightly overwritten to minus 17 degrees, at which point the computers fortunately refused any further nose down command. But the captain was unable to move his side stick and thought it to be locked by the autopilot. In fact, the reason for the jammed side stick was much simpler. When the purser entered the flight deck as the captain was taking pictures, the latter moved his seat back a bit so he could better talk to the purser. He also put down his camera in front of his armrest that was attached to the seat. Do you know what's right in front of that area? Right, the side stick. When the purser left the flight deck, the captain moved his seat back forward a bit, jamming the bulky camera between the armrest and the base of the side stick. Matching markings on the housing of the camera, as well as on the side stick, confirmed this theory. Chemical analysis even confirmed that the plastic of the side stick had transferred to the camera and vice versa. 1 minute and 44 seconds later, the captain moved his seat further forward. By doing so, the camera pressed against the side stick firmly until finally, the force was large enough to overcome the side stick locking force. This disengaged the autopilot and immediately moved the side stick fully forward. As the plane descended at a pitch of minus 17 degrees, it picked up speed quickly. In the meantime, the first officer returned to the flight deck and attempted to pull back on his own side stick. The fact that the captain's stick was jammed in the full forward position was not recognized by either pilot, so the first officer's actions had only minimal effects. When both side sticks are operated simultaneously, their inputs are added and an oral warning is issued. This meant that the maximum command the first officer could achieve by pulling back while the captain's control was fully forward was a net zero command. No, it wasn't the first officer's or the captain's actions that saved the plane, it was mostly the plane's computers themselves. As the Voyager descended at a steep angle, it picked up speed tremendously. When it reached the maximum allowable speed, the high-speed protection of the aircraft kicked in. This function cancels any further nose-down inputs of the plane, reduces thrust, and gradually pulls the aircraft up to bleed off speed in order to return to a stable flight regime. As it did so, the camera became unstuck, once again enabling the captain and the first officer to control the Voyager normally. Unfortunately, the committee was unable to convincingly find out how the camera became unstuck. It is possible that it was dislodged by the side stick movements, but it is also thinkable that the captain finally recognized the obstruction and removed it by hand. The camera had been there for 33 agonizingly long seconds, sending an airliner into a dive. In the end, the final report criticized many things that went wrong on that day. Boredom is a given fact in aviation, and the captain's actions were not prohibited, but not very professional. The committee criticized the captain for taking photos while alone on the flight deck, even though this is not explicitly prohibited. The careless placement of his camera was the ultimate trigger of the accident, after all. The first officer was also condemned for being absent from the flight deck for so long. The RAF's operations manual dictates that an absence from the flight deck is only permitted in case of operational or physiological needs, i.e. to go to the bathroom. Those are the rules, but as a personal comment, allow me to say that in almost every airline, you will find individuals who take long breaks or take pictures while alone on the flight deck in cruise flight. Still, the captain was of course ultimately responsible for the aircraft, and therefore was court-martialed. In the trial, he was sentenced to a suspended prison sentence for his actions, and was discharged from the Royal Air Force. Now, do you think that was fair, or did the captain fall victim to an honest and human mistake? Let me know in the comments down below. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe for many interesting aviation videos. Or leave a super thanks to show your support. See you all in the next one.